Hello, global gardeners. It's great to see you here on another Monday. And this is one of my favorite days of the year. And I know it's one of yours as well. So let's spend the next 90 minutes talking about gardening, asking questions, answering questions, sharing all of our experiences, even talking about the Cherokee purple tomato we're about to enjoy as Kevin did. So always nice to have you here. So great to see you on a topsy-turvy day. So much of the United States is experiencing just crazy weather, and I know we are going crazy with it. Can you imagine what our plants are going through? My garden for the next few days and the last handful of days has been about 20 degrees Fahrenheit below average. Right now, the Pacific Northwest of the United States is about 30 degrees above average. It's just crazy. It's just upside down. And as this omega dome of heat moves across the United States, it's just going to wreak havoc with many of us. So I feel the pain of those of you that are in Oregon and Washington, and hopefully your plants are going to survive. Had a nice visit with my stepdaughter who lives in Portland, Oregon. She was here this last week and we visited, and now she's back home trying to protect her plants from 112 degree Fahrenheit weather. That's 44 degrees Celsius. All-time record heat for that part of the country. It's never been recorded that hot. And so it just goes to show that all of us have struggles in our gardens one way or another, usually when we least expect it. So I wish all of you the best that are experiencing some of those huge temperatures or high temperatures and the huge swings and all the rest that we have. But for now, let's just go ahead and move forward. Today we're going to be focusing more so on the idea of harvesting your summer crops and actually trying to get more of the crops, more of the food that you're trying to grow, partly while you're confronting some of these big issues. So good morning to everybody who's here. Frank in Texas, nice to see you checking in. Jennifer from Long Island, New York. Tracy from Georgia. Claudia, good morning to you as well. Phil says, I'm harvesting my potatoes early this year to replace them with fall crops. I ordered my compost amendments early this year so I can recharge and replant. Good for you, Phil. That's one of the issues, and so I'll go ahead and start talking about the theme of today using that, because potatoes is a great example. And so 4:39 p.m. had asked us or brought up a similar point, saying that they want to grow Brussels sprouts where they have garlic right now, and wondering if it's best to direct sow or to start from seed now. And so both of these issues, garlic and potatoes, are typically harvested midsummer. And depending on where you live, it might even be earlier than that. So what that means is you've got a bed, or you've got grow bags, or you've got containers that you've been growing garlic or potatoes or many of the other spring crops. What do you do with it at that point? And how do you approach the rest of your summer? Too often, and this is the way I was when I was a new gardener, I would grow potatoes and say, okay, I got the potatoes in the ground. I take care of the potatoes. They're growing. Then it reaches time to harvest. I harvest the potatoes. And that's all I thought about. Then the potatoes are harvested, and that bed or that bag now just rests for the rest of the season. Because in my mind, as a new gardener, every time we take an activity in a bed, it's just for a single crop. And so it's great that the two of you are looking forward and thinking about that next phase, because that's really one of the keys to getting as big a harvest as you can through the entire growing season. And so anticipate that. If you know that you're going to be harvesting your potatoes and your garlic, start planning it weeks ahead. So my garlic, I'm guessing, is about 3 weeks away from harvesting. I've noticed some of the leaves starting to turn brown. So I'm going to have to put something, I don't have to, but I want to put something in that bed to carry me through for the rest of the season. And some of my potatoes have started flowering, which is a sign that there are actually tubers forming in that soil. And so my potatoes will be ready to harvest anywhere from the next couple weeks to the next couple months. I still will have time, even in my short growing season, to grow more plants. And so tying back into 4:39 p.m.'s question about whether to direct sow or start from seed now, it depends on how long your growing season is. And so I have a relatively short growing season. So if I want to put plants in the ground because I have that short season, I probably want to start the seed indoors or outdoors in a pot so that I can transplant them when I'm harvesting my garlic or my potatoes. If it's a fast growing plant, then I won't have to do that. So or actually if it's a plant that can do well in the cooler conditions. And so for example, in my garlic bed, I'm planning on growing carrots and other cool season plants to carry me into the fall. And so I don't need to start those plants early. I will be direct sowing my kale and my carrots and my radish and my chard. All those plants can handle the cool weather of fall, but I can plant them. I can start those seeds in the heat of summer. Brussels sprouts can take a long time to grow, but they also can handle cool weather conditions. So when you're making a choice about those type of plants to grow into the fall, it's important to identify how long it takes for that plant to grow and how long your season is before you reach your first frost date of fall. And the first frost date is just a target because most of those plants can shrug off that first frost without too much difficulty. But you need to have an idea of how much time you have left in your growing season and if that's enough time to start from seed outdoors in the garden or whether you should start ahead of time and transplant a plant. And so, for instance, I could pull out my potatoes because they're in bags and those bags can be moved into warmer areas. And I could put plants in. I could put cucumbers or squashes or something along those lines that might fruit relatively quickly and continue to get a harvest along those lines. Or if you live in an area with a really long growing season, you might actually be able to put some peppers and tomatoes in some of those beds that you're harvesting now or in the near future. So it all has to do with how much more time your plants will have to grow before they're going to be impacted by the cold. But definitely think about that. Think about that succession planting in the summer because a single bed might give you 3 distinct crops. You can get a spring crop, a summer crop, and a fall crop of completely different plants. So we'll talk more about that as the questions arise, but that's a good way to start today is to throw out that basic idea of planning now for the fall or the late summer based on the plants you know are going to be coming out of the ground here pretty soon. Okay, let's see what else we have. Paul Biggs says, same with bush beans, putting pole bean seedlings out this week. And that's a good point too. I'm actually putting some pole bean seeds in the ground this week because I'm staggering my planting times. And so that's another way to try to get the most from your harvest that you can. So I put some bean seeds in 3 weeks ago or so, and I'll be putting more bean seeds in this week. And I'll probably put some more bean seeds in a couple more weeks so that I have a longer period of time to harvest my beans. If you just do all your beans at once, again, a very common tendency of most gardeners. We're going to grow beans, so we put all of our bean seeds in the ground at the same time, take care of those plants, and then harvest, and essentially harvest all of our beans at the same time. Well, there may still be a month or 6 weeks or more in your growing season after you harvest the beans. And now you've got no more fresh beans. If you're growing beans for the purpose of drying and having pinto beans in your pantry to cook up in the winter, it's not as big an issue. You can have that one big harvest. But if you're growing pole beans to eat fresh, wouldn't you rather have that opportunity to have those pole beans for dinner over a period of 6 to 8 weeks, rather than just having fresh pole beans over a 2-week period of summer? So think about that aspect as well. So good point. Go ahead and start thinking about adding more seeds as the season progresses, just to lengthen the harvest that you get from those particular crops. Okay, let's see. Patrick, thank you so much for that super chat contribution. Always great to have you here. My cabbage has abundance of healthy leaves, but not forming heads. Suggestions, please. It could be the heat. We've had just so much heat recently that the heads, I've noticed this on my broccoli as well, that the heads just aren't forming like they would in a cooler environment. And most cabbages typically will have the cool weather to start forming the nice heads. And so that would be my guess right off the bat, is just the heat we've had recently that would cause the heads to not form as well. And I've noticed this as well. I was harvesting some of my daikon radishes this last week, and a number of them have bolted. And when you see a radish, for instance, and many of these cooler season plants, if you see a radish or a carrot or almost any root crop that has bolted, it sent up that flower stalk, if you pull it, you're going to notice that the root is very thin. The daikon radish roots of those bolted plants didn't look like a radish at all. It looked like just a regular thin root. And the same holds true. Had a couple turnip plants that had started to bolt, pulled those up. The roots didn't look at all like turnips. And that's because when a plant gets stressed, it's going to put most of its effort into surviving and then propagating itself by sending up that flower stalk. And so the result will be, in rooting plants, you're not going to have the big bulbous root that you're looking for. But in other plants, like broccoli, for instance, where we're harvesting the flower of the plant, it's not going to take the time to form a large broccoli head. It's going to probably form a small broccoli head and go directly to seed, because the plant's trying to protect itself. And then when you have those big leafy plants like cabbage or spinach, because it's happening in a similar way to my spinach as well. The leaves really grow fast so that they can suck up all the sun's energy and bolt and set seed. And so cabbage is a biennial. You probably may see, if you see seed this year on your cabbage, that'll be a really good indication. If it starts to bolt, that it was because of the hot conditions, because normally a cabbage would sit over winter and you'd get the seed the second year. But it's one of those things that this is just a crazy year with all this heat. The plants don't know how to react, and so don't be surprised when you're not getting the type of harvest that you're expecting, be it a root or a leaf or a flower head. It's just so messed up. We just had such crazy weather here in the United States that the plants are definitely suffering. Pamela's asking, why are my carrots pale and not dark orange? Otherwise, they look great. It's a similar issue. My guess is same type of thing, that when the carrot is stressed, it's not going to give you that nice dark orange color, which happens when it's in a happy spot with the rich soil and the moist conditions. And so look at your soil first to make sure that you've got the nutrients that a carrot needs, and also that the moisture level is good. But it also could be that the plant is directing more of its energy into the leaves. so that they'll be ready to go and possibly bolt early. And that's often related to the heat. And carrots are another biennial. They should not flower until the second season. But last year I had carrots that set flower in the first season, and it's because of the heat. And when I pulled up those plants at the end of the season, they were definitely lighter in color. And that just means the energy is not going to the root, the energy is going to the leaves. So shading your carrots might help to try to knock down the heat a little bit. That's one of those things I've talked about before, just trying to keep a cooler area. And Greg says, all my Scarlet Nantes carrots bolted, and I started them from seed this year. There you go. That's the exact issue. I saved thousands and thousands of Scarlet Nantes carrot seeds. In fact, I have a video talking about saving seeds, but that was a different variety. But at the school garden, we saved Scarlet Nantes seeds one year, and it was the second season. But it was a typical summer. They grew the first year. We overwintered them and saved seeds the second year. But if the plant is stressed, it will accelerate that timeline. So like Greg and like I've experienced, it's just craziness when the plant is not getting the conditions that it expects, and therefore it has to grow in an unexpected way, and unexpected for the plant and unexpected for us. Okay. Taco Promotions is saying, good day to you. I hope all is well. It is. For me, I hope it is with everyone else as well. I was curious, for full-size banana herb, do you think they will be able to fruit well in a container? Possibly. A lot of it depends on your weather. A lot of it depends on the site, and a lot of it depends on how you choose to grow it, if there's enough room to grow. And so when you grow in containers, and this holds true for herbs, for fruiting plants, the containers tend to dry out faster, and the soil tends to be warmer than it would be in a big raised bed or in the ground. And so you have to anticipate that, because warm soil can accelerate some of these problems that we're talking about. Problems with bolting. It may actually cause fruiting earlier or quicker, or may not reach a point where it's fully formed fruit because of the temperature of the pot. So look a little bit closer as to where you're growing your plants when you're growing in containers. And if you're growing it, for instance, and I had this issue recently with some of the plants I was hardening off. They were in front of a wall that had reflective heat from the sun, and the plants that were right next to the wall actually ended up getting fried because not only the heat of the sun, but that reflective heat from that wall. And so when you grow in containers, that's an aspect you have to look at if you're wondering about how well they'll fruit or how well they'll grow. Take a lot of time looking at the location that you're going to put that container and what the conditions of that plant needs. Whether it gets away with some sun, some shade, a balance, and needs more of one or more of the other. But in all cases, be ready to have to water a container more often. And so I'm guessing it'll do okay in a pot, but you just have to make sure that you're keeping the soil moist and that the soil has nutrition to start with, either worm castings or compost or a balanced fertilizer that's mixed into the soil. And then keep track of all of us with our containers. You've got to track them on a daily basis just to make sure they're doing okay. And the rest of our garden, so much of our garden we can water, come back in 2 or 3 days and the plants will be okay. But you might not be able to get away with that when you're doing container gardening. So just something to think about. Nicole's saying, my Brussels sprouts are tiny and I'm battling aphids on them. I'm tempted to pull them all out and give up on them. Don't give up on them. Aphids are one of those things that are so easy to control, and especially with a plant like Brussels sprouts. Brussels sprouts is a pretty tough plant. Get out there with a good strong spray of water and spray off the aphids. Do that a couple times a day and you'll probably eliminate most of the aphids. But by having some aphids, you're also attracting some of those beneficial insects. And so in a recent video, where I was talking about pest control in the garden, I showed one of my yew plants, and the ladybug larvae that were on that plant was covered with aphids. I mean, it was sticky with the honeydew. And then the ladybug larva moved in. This last week, I was looking at that plant. There's are adult ladybugs on it now. There's some larva ladybugs on that plant, but I couldn't find an aphid anywhere. And so the plant was infested by aphids, and now they're all gone because the ladybugs took care of them. And I didn't do a spray. So if you do a spray of water on your plants that have aphids, and then anticipate that those beneficial insects will move in, you should be able to take it and get it under control. I just suggest not giving up. If it has reached the point where the plants are so damaged and so many leaves are eaten and the plant is shriveled, then yes, it's okay to pull the plant and start over again or put something else in its place. But aphids are just so easy to control with water that if you get on top of it as soon as you notice the aphids, it's usually not as big an issue. Okay, there's Heidi. Always good to see Heidi and Jay with us. Heidi says, ladybugs totally ate all the aphids on my 2 rows of Sharon plants. Yay! Ladybugs, like most of us, are among our favorite insects. And so make a healthy place for them in your garden. Plant all those flowers and grasses and keep your brush piles and let some weeds grow, and the ladybugs will be there. And yes, like Heidi and me, they'll take care of the ones that do show up on your plant. And so Kevin's saying, yes, that's true as well. It depends on amount of water. Like if a big storm is coming, I pick anything blushing to prevent splitting and too much water content. And I had a couple questions about this, talking about tomatoes splitting this last week. When a tomato splits, it's usually because there's a big rush of water into the soil and the roots take it up, and that fruit starts to grow, but it's growing too fast with that water infusion, and the skin can't keep up with it and it splits. And so in a normal situation with tomatoes, it's a nice gradual process. The skin is growing at the same rate that the fruit inside is growing, and the whole tomato gets larger. But there does reach a point where the skin either slows down or has reached its final size. The inside hasn't developed yet, or not developed completely. It hasn't matured. And if there's a huge inrush of water into that fruit, it's going to burst the skin. And so that is one of those situations where if you know a big rain is coming and you have a lot of tomatoes on your plants that are ripening but not ready to pick yet, cover those plants with a tarp, or cover the soil with a tarp to try to reduce the amount of inflow quickly of a lot of water. Also, avoid watering very heavily when your tomatoes are at that point. That can help reduce some of those issues with the splitting. Or, like Kevin pointed out, go ahead and harvest. If you know a big rain is coming, it's often better to harvest your tomatoes early and allow them to continue ripening on your kitchen counter than to wait until after the rain and then have the splitting. You can still eat all of the tomatoes with split skins. It's just you need to eat them right away because they don't store as well. So there's a couple things to think about. Melissa's saying the only plants I have that split are Berkeley tie-dye. It's so frustrating trying to keep them hydrated in the hot California summer. And that is one of those difficult things to think about, is how to keep your plants hydrated. And Johnny Caniseed is saying, I live in the desert. Any good tips on saving water? And so for both of those issues, for saving water and for trying to keep the plants hydrated, it works hand in hand. And I think the best way to do that is with organic matter in the soil. The compost that you work into your soil, all of that organic material, it could be grass, it could be crushed up leaves that I usually put in at the end of the season. It could be peat, whatever it happens to be. Have organic matter in the soil, because that organic matter not only enriches the life in the soil, but they also act like little sponges. So if you're in California or the desert and you're trying to keep your soil moist for your plants, you have a couple options. You can either water multiple times a day, that's not saving water, or you have the organic matter in the soil where you water once a day or maybe once every other day, and that organic matter now soaks up that moisture and holds it in the soil. And you can see lots of research on this, how organic matter in the soil increases the water retention of that soil. So right off the bat, that's a great way to keep the soil moist and to reduce the amount of water you need, because the water is being retained in the soil by that organic matter. And then mulch on top of that. So if you have a layer of organic mulch on top of the soil, that now reduces the water evaporation, and you've got the compost or organic matter that's holding on to it as much as possible, and then you have the mulch that's reducing the evaporation when the water does leave that organic matter, and the soil will stay moist longer. Your plants will benefit from it. And also, mulch on soil helps keep it cooler, and so the cooler soil is often better for the plants. They'll grow better in warm soil as opposed to hot soil. So it all comes down to organic matter in the soil or as a mulch. That's really the best way to deal with watering issues when you're in an environment that you have those concerns. You can think about using drip irrigation or soaker hoses, but drip irrigation and soaker hoses, which target the water at the roots of the plant and are great ways to irrigate, you're really reducing the benefits of those methods of irrigation if you don't have a system in place in your soil and on top of the soil is a mulch to hold the water once it gets into the soil. So that's what I do, and that typically works pretty well. Okay, let's see what we have popping up here. Jeribian is saying, any suggestions for the heat in the Pacific Northwest where it's nearly 30 degrees above the normal high? And yeah, I touched on that when we first started off. Shade and water. One of the things, we've talked about this in the recent past as well, when we talked about shade cloth on the plants. Shade cloth, a tarp, a sheet, something to cover the plants and provide a little bit of shade, and then misting the plants, keeping the soil moist, can also cool the conditions around the plants. We talked about transpiration recently, and so when the plant's breathing, it's using a lot of moisture, so you have to keep the soil moist so that the normal transpiration, the breathing of the plant, there's enough water in the soil for the plant to have that normal transpiration process. So when it gets really hot, you do need to water more. And so for those of us that live in a dry region or in the desert, we already know we have to water more because we are dealing with hot temperatures like that. But if you're used to cooler conditions and you're on a schedule where you water your garden every second day in the morning, and suddenly you're confronted with these extremely hot temperatures, take a look at your soil, take a look at your plants, because you're most likely going to have to revert or shift to an everyday watering, and get out there in the afternoon and check your soil, because it may be drying out faster than you expect. And you may need to go to a morning water and an evening watering to keep your plants alive during these severe heat conditions. And so be flexible. Be ready to go out there and modify your normal gardening activities when you're confronted by some of these extreme conditions, because it's these extreme conditions that will often damage our plants, because we're doing everything the same and the plant is trying to adjust. The plant's not doing everything the same. And so you have to adjust just like your plant is adjusting to these crazy conditions. And so every garden is different. Every garden is unique. and how you treat your plants will change on a daily, weekly, monthly basis as the weather impacts your garden as well. So be ready to adjust. And in this heat, water is the first line of defense. And then throw in some shade, and hopefully that'll allow your plants to survive until the conditions get back to normal. So. Yankee Sister, always good to see you here. A hot day in Connecticut for you. I hope you can take advantage of some shade and air conditioning yourself. A lot of hard work expanding my garden this year. Will still grow, but take somewhat of a break this fall. Always love watching, and I always love having you here. So that's a good point. I'm glad you bring that up. And I had thought about that in a couple weeks, actually, as one of my philosophy points is to take a break. Today's focus is actually pushing through and trying to get more out of your summer harvest and planting more seeds and putting more plants in the ground. But sometimes it is important to just take a break. And I acknowledge that. I was just talking about that yesterday, and we were having dinner and saying, you know, in September, I think in September, I'm going to take a little bit of a break. I'm actually going to take a couple weeks, do a vacation, not worry so much about the videos and the live stream and the garden. It'll be mostly done at that point, and just in maintenance mode and some harvest mode. So I'll either find some volunteers or hire my grandkids to take care of the garden because I need a break. It's okay. So Yankee Sister, good for you. If you need to take a break going into fall, I say go for it, because I'm thinking that exact thought as I move forward, that I will need a break. Not because I don't like what I'm doing, but just because we get so focused sometimes on what we're doing in the garden that we lose sight of some of the other stuff out there that we can take advantage of and get out there and do. So think about that as well as you plan your garden. What's the best time for you to take a break? And often the fall is the perfect time for gardeners to take that break. So start thinking about that right now. If you don't have a vacation in mind, or you don't have that plan for just a brief period, a week or two, whatever you want to take between plantings, between sowings, start thinking about it now, and you might make your mental health a little bit better. And Melissa's saying, I took a week-long break last month. I watered, but otherwise left it alone. We all need a break. Yes, thanks for saying that, Melissa, because it really is. It just gets so overwhelming sometimes, especially when we're confronting the heat and the weather and all the insects and the aphids, all that is happening, and you're fighting it constantly. Take a break, kick back, and just enjoy the garden. Just water. And I do that. I actually did that the end of April, beginning of May. I had put plants in the ground in April, or seeds in the ground in April for my early spring garden. And then we just had such severe cold, it killed everything. And I said, I need a break. And I didn't say this until right now, but my garden is a little bit later than normal this year because I just took a break at the end of April, beginning of May, because the weather was crazy. I was just wasting my efforts in the garden. And I said, I need a break. Not a break from gardening, but a break from actively doing anything in the garden. And then I got started back up again and put plants and seeds in, and the garden's doing great. But I needed that break just because it's devastating for all of us when we lose an entire planting because of the weather. You can either give up or you can take a break for a little bit and then push forward when you're ready. So I'm glad that Melissa and Yankee Sister are thinking along those lines, because that is one of those things to deal with. Lily saying, I'm battling with gophers now, and I definitely feel that angry face. It's interesting, and I actually spent some time this morning trying to see if I saw the gophers out, because they'll often pop their head above the ground. And I'm not sure, I think I may have mentioned this. I don't remember if I was talking to one of my buddies or if I was telling you all about the cat in my garden. It's a neighborhood cat that I've seen every morning for a couple weeks, patrolling my garden on the hunt. And I noticed a couple weeks ago as I was out watering The cat came, I gave her a wide berth, and about 10 or 15 minutes later, she was walking away with a gopher in her mouth. So I think my gopher problem is mostly under control. I haven't seen any indications of gophers in a few weeks now, and I have my neighborhood cat to thank for it. And so I know a lot of people have neighborhood cats that they're trying to keep out of their garden. You can keep them out of your beds. One of the best ways to do that is to use chicken wire on the surface of the soil, and that chicken wire on the surface is often enough to keep the cats out of your beds, but definitely keeping the cats from digging in your bed and doing their business, which is never any fun to dig up when you're planting. But allow the cats to actually roam your garden, because they're going to eat some of those pests that you have. Cats will take care of the gophers and the voles and the mice and the rats and even slugs and some of those other pests in the garden. You've probably seen a cat go after a grasshopper. So cats can actually be great. I don't have a cat of my own, but I got the neighborhood cat now. And so add that to your bag of tricks. If you can introduce or at least support a cat in your garden, you may have fewer pests. That was totally unexpected this year. I was trying to figure out how I was going to battle my gophers, and I don't think I have to worry about that anymore. Severin is saying, I live in the country. My working cat is as important as the tractor out here. Absolutely. And when we lived in a different spot where we had a barn with mice in the barn, there were a couple cats that lived in the barn, and they weren't feral cats. They were just cats that lived in the barn that we really didn't need to worry about feeding, except maybe in the winter months, because they took care of themselves, and they did a very important job keeping the barn clear and the rest of the garden area clear. So good point. They can be very important. Let's see. Habiba says the cats at the farm I help out at are sun worshipers, rarely chasing anything. That's great. I bet you they're doing a lot of their work at night. So they're just soaking up the sun in the day so they can go to work at night. That's fun. And Sarah says we had a really severe rat problem in our yard. Seems to have cleared up now. Lots of outdoor cats in the neighborhood. So there you go. So I'm a dog person, and so my pets have always been dogs. Even though we have had an occasional cat in our household from some other family member, but the cats in the neighborhood, as you can see, it's not just me. There's lots of others that can play a very important role. So that's important. Glad to see it. Okay, let's see what else we have. Lily's saying, I just put bird netting over my tomato bed, and now I see gopher holes in the bed. We didn't put wire under all the beds. Need to fix that. And so some of you have noticed this in my videos. I don't usually point it out in every video, but I have wire underneath all of my beds because of that gopher problem that I've had. So if there's any issue with gophers, yes, you should have wire under your raised beds. It's more difficult to do in an in-ground bed, but that's another reason why I use the raised beds, is because of gopher and vole problems, so that I could put the wire underneath the bed and not have that issue. But so this fall, or whenever the next time is that you're going to be amending the soil in that bed, it'll be some work, but go ahead and take out that soil, put some wire in the bottom, and then put back good newly amended soil for next year, and hopefully that problem will be greatly reduced. And I haven't had any gophers in my beds as a result of having that wire. So it definitely does its job, along with the cats. Okay, let's see what else we have. Linda's saying, I would feel right at home in the garden photo. Very nice. So let's go ahead and talk about the garden photo. This comes from Shannon Lawson. And that was exactly my thought too, that I would feel right at home in this garden behind me. So thank you, Shannon, for sharing the photo that I can have as the backdrop today, because this looks like a very inviting garden. And so often we focus on things like just growing it for food, and we lose sight of the inviting aspect of it. Do we want our garden to not only entice us to come in and enjoy, but also others who happen to see it? And so this is one of those gardens. It's not a big space. It's a small garden, but don't you want to just sit out in this garden in the evening and enjoy a nice adult beverage as the sun sets? That's the way I look at it. And so let me point out a couple things that I think are really pretty interesting. So right here, you can actually see the hoop that goes up over the garden beds. And so there's one garden bed on the right and one garden bed on the left. And then there's the cattle panel hoop that connects the two. And so it's a really nice space. There's plants growing up it. There's flowers. There's compost. But I really love right there the pink T-posts. And I've thought about painting my T-posts. So I have archways, and I added a new archway recently that are held in place by the T-posts. And I've thought about painting them a dark green or a brown so that they blend in with the plants that are going to be growing over the archway. But now that I see this, I'm thinking I need to add some color to that spot. And so these T-posts that Shannon has actually support, you can kind of see it right here. It looks like a netting that goes up the post. And so there's some plants that are being supported by the netting that's between those T-posts. But go for it with color in your garden. If you've got a post that you're using as a trellis, paint it pink. I think this is fantastic. I really love it. I was thinking about hiding things away so they're not so obvious. Go for it. Make the things in your garden as obvious as possible. And especially if you like having the flowers like Shannon does. You have flowers around the outside. Well, why not turn some of the structure of your garden into a color? Basically adding the same color to your garden that the flowers would be adding to your garden. So I think this is really fantastic. And then when you look around the edges, you can see the bark pathway or the wood chip path that leads around different bushes, the trees, the tools up against the fence. This is just really a nice looking garden area, very inviting. And so I want to again thank you, Shannon, for sending me this photo and allowing me to use it. If you look just right here, you can see there's a pathway light. And so again, looks like it's an inviting space. The lights around the garden so that you can sit out here in the evening and enjoy the space. And I have a few lights in my garden. I'll be adding more. I've got lights in my front landscape. But as I develop my garden into an evening sitting space, that's exactly what I'll be doing too, is adding lighting so that you can easily walk to and from without tripping over anything. But it adds a nice warm ambiance to the whole space. So I'm glad you noticed that. I'm glad you thought it was a inviting space, because that's exactly my thought as well. And hopefully this might give you a couple ideas of things that you can try in your garden as well. And if you have photos that you want me to use as a backdrop, send them to me at gardenerscott@gardenerscott.com. Do try to send them in landscape mode. I had some different photos that I was going to use today, but they were in portrait mode. And when I put them into the backdrop, you won't see the whole scene. And so a portrait photo, because this is a landscape view in the live stream, a lot of the photo is cut off if you send me it in portrait mode. So send it to me in landscape mode, and it'll be better for all of us to see the whole garden space. And I'll add you to the queue. I've got a number of other gardeners with videos that they've sent that you'll be seeing in weeks ahead. So it's always fun. I learned something, like I just said, with the pink posts. I learned something from all of your gardens every time I see a new garden space. So that's one reason why I like to show the gardens, because there's always something new that all of us can learn from. So there you have it. I think that's awesome. and I'm glad I could share it today. I just love those pink posts. I think that's wonderful. Okay, let's see. Chris is saying, wait till next year. I'll send you some awesome garden pics. Okay, Chris, I look forward to that. I'd love to have some of your photos and along with all of you. I think that's important. Let's talk a little bit more. Some of the other things I wanted to talk about with the idea of maximizing your summer harvest. The easiest thing you can do to get more of your harvest is to harvest. And so we talked a little bit about the rooting plants that, or the root plants that send up their flower stalk, they bolt. Well, that's what plants try to do. They want to send seeds out into the world to propagate that plant. So if you're growing a fruiting plant, so if you're growing tomatoes or peppers or zucchini, any of those plants that are a fruit that's filled with seeds, every time you harvest one of those fruits, you're telling the plant that they just lost out on the opportunity to propagate. And so they're going to send out more fruit. And so the more you harvest, the more fruit you're going to get. I know it sounds crazy, but if you have a zucchini plant and you just let it grow and then harvest it all at once at the end of the season, you might have 6 or 7 pretty good sized zucchini. They're going to be big. But if you harvest the zucchini on a regular basis when they're 6 or 7 inches long, which is what I think is the best length to harvest zucchini for taste and texture, you're going to get more and more zucchini to replace those that you harvested. So instead of 6 or 7 really big zucchini, you may end up with 15 to 20 smaller zucchini over the course of the season, and maybe even more. And the same holds true for the peppers and the tomatoes and all of the other fruits with seeds inside. So harvest. Harvest as soon as they're ready to harvest. Harvest often, and you will get more of those fruit. It does depend on the type of plant. It does depend on the length of your growing season to determine exactly how much more you're going to get. Cucumbers are a great example of this. In my short season, I can grow cucumbers, harvest, grow more, harvest, grow more, harvest, and the plant does have a lifespan, and at some point it will start to slow down. And so for me, cucumbers are one of those plants that I can get multiple harvests from a single plant over the course of a season. But melons don't do as well for me because they take longer to grow. Now, if I harvested the melon, it would induce more melons on the plant, but my season just isn't long enough for those subsequent melons to ripen. And so it depends. But peas, beans, all of those kind of plants, harvest often, harvest every time you see something on the plant, and you'll get more. Strawberries, another great example, the fruiting plants. If you see a strawberry, pull the strawberry. I usually eat it. They never make it into the house. But by harvesting those fruits, it will induce the plant to form more fruit. And so that's so easy. I mean, that's why we're growing a lot of these plants, is to harvest. Just don't delay the harvest, and you'll probably get more harvests. And that way you'll be able to maximize the amount of food that you're getting from your garden. Okay, let's see what Laurelful is saying. 2 of the pepper plants have good peppers started. The plants are smaller than the rest of them that are not yet covered in peppers. So those 2 plants were probably more stressed. That is a good point. And I've noticed that. I put in some peppers a couple weeks ago. You've probably heard, and I've talked occasionally about the idea that when you have small plants or plants that you've just recently put in the ground, if you pinch off the flowers, you're putting more of the plant's energy into growing the plant and the roots, so that when the flowers and the fruit develop, the plant will be stronger, more robust. If you allow those early flowers to develop into fruit, it is going to cause the plant to put its energy into developing the seeds through those fruits. And so on a pepper plant, and I'm actually starting to track this possibly for a future video, where I have let some of those flowers develop. And on the plant right next door, I've been pinching off those flowers, and I'm going to start tracking it as the plant grows to see just what a big difference the plant size will be, and if there's a noticeable difference in the amount of fruit. But yes, as to Laurelful's point, you can see that. You can see the stress that the smaller plants often are under, especially when they're trying to support some fruit that the plant really hasn't developed fully to the point that it can support that fruit. And so keep that in the back of your brain, that generally, and again, I'm testing it just to be more precise, and I've seen mixed results in some studies I've read, but the stronger the plant, the bigger the plant, the more it's going to flower and the more fruit you're going to get. The smaller the plant, as you might guess, the less you're going to get. So if you can try to keep your plants from being stressed early in their lives to allow them to build to the point that they have that strength, then you're more likely to get a bigger harvest. You're going to get more flowers, you're going to get more fruit, and again, that's why we're typically trying to do it. So Taco Promotions is asking, from what you're saying, if I'm harvesting fruit and it happens to be underripe, would that impact the total yield of the plant? So yeah, same idea. Even if you harvest an underripe fruit, it's still going to generate more fruit. And so you can harvest before they're fully ripe and expect that that will impact the plant, that it will generate more of the fruit from that plant. So yes, that is what I'm saying. Whether it's underripe or overripe, it's going to make for a stronger plant and more of the fruit. If the plant is smaller and you pinch it off as a flower before it fruits, that's best. If you're planning to harvest it underripe because it's a young plant, I would say just go ahead and pinch it off as a flower before it starts directing its energy into developing that fruit. But either way, the plant wants to fruit, it wants to seed, it wants to propagate, and you're disrupting its normal cycle. You know, plants like, yeah, I'll set out some fruit, there'll be some seeds, then I'll die. And you take the fruit away, you take those seeds away, and the plant now has to work to send out more. And that's why you get the extra harvest. It's because the plant is working to send out more, because now it's in a stress situation where it thinks it's going to die and it has to propagate before that happens. Hi, Chris. Thanks for that Super Chat contribution. Please grow enough food to survive without stores. And that's, I know that there's a number of you that are homesteaders and you're growing your own food. And I think the question came up last week a little bit, or maybe it was just in one of the comments. But that's one reason why I also talk about saving your food. The preservation of your food, I think, is a very important part of gardening. And so, as Chris points out, and like I talked about earlier briefly with the beans, you can grow food for different purposes. You can grow it to eat fresh, or you can grow it for the purposes of preserving it for future meals. And so beans, as the example, you've got fresh beans and you've got dried beans. And dried beans will last for years and years. And so if you add that aspect to your gardening, where you are preserving it, not just eating it fresh, but preserving it, you're saving yourself a trip to the store every time you go to your pantry and pull out a cup of beans to fix for dinner or whatever else it happens to be. I have a video coming up here at the end of this week where I'll talk about chamomile. I harvested my chamomile flowers to make chamomile tea. And so there's things like that, as simple as making tea. Those of you, I'm guessing there's a bunch of you who like a nice glass of chamomile tea in the evening. Well, I'm also guessing most of you are going to the store to buy that chamomile tea. Why not grow your own chamomile flowers and make your own chamomile tea? So there's so much that we can do in the garden to save ourselves money and to keep us from having to go to the store and buy things that are so easy to grow and use in our own kitchen. So thanks for bringing that up, Chris. I appreciate it. Oh, sorry, clicked on the wrong one. So Jennifer, I can see a lot of my veggies from the garden, as well as making jellies. And so all the fruit. So you've seen in my videos, I've talked about it. I've got currant bushes everywhere. The purpose of my currant bushes is to make currant jelly. I love currants, and currant jelly is incredible. And my raspberries, it's to make raspberry jam. And I've got the gooseberries and all the honeyberries, all the rest. I am going to make jam and jelly with all of those fruits. So you definitely have the right idea, Jennifer. Jams and jellies are a great way to use the fruits in your garden. My rhubarb, I grow rhubarb not to make the little crisps that you can make, but to make rhubarb jelly. Rhubarb jelly is incredible. And so I grow my rhubarb to make rhubarb jelly. So broaden your world a little bit as to what you consider preservation, food preservation, and what you can do in your garden, because you can dry, you can freeze, you can, you can jelly. There are just so many things you can do with your harvests that not only are we maximizing by trying to get as much as possible, but you got to think about the future. You got to think, how are you going to use that after you get the harvest? And so lots of great ideas. I have a number of videos. You know, it's funny, not funny, haha, necessarily, but my videos, and I've got 270 videos, and now I've got 67 live streams, lots of gardening information. My worst performing videos, the ones that no one sees, are my preservation videos. I've got a bunch of videos on how to ferment, on how to dry, on how to use the harvest. And part of it is YouTube, part of it is what gardeners look for. But you can look at my library. I got a bunch of videos that talk about preservation, because I think that's an important aspect of gardening. But most gardeners are so focused on how to plant, how to harvest, how to grow, that they're not looking for Gardener Scott videos on how to pickle beets, or how to make garlic scape pesto, or any of those other videos I have. So think about that. Expand your world a little bit, and you can find some of that in my library, and I'll be making more, like the chamomile tea. That's not a typical video that I do on my channel, but I think it's an important aspect to add to our bag of tricks when we do our gardening. So there you have it. It's a shout out for an unapologetic plug for my videos, because I think I've got some pretty good preservation videos. I've got a video on how to can peaches. I've got a video on how to make sauerkraut. I've got a video on how to make jelly. I've got a video on how to dry herbs. These are all things you should be thinking about doing. Not just because I do it, but because I think gardeners in general should know these ways of preserving our harvest past the point of harvest. So, Kevin, thank you so much for that contribution. I appreciate it. When do you harvest? In the morning, after watering, in the evening? Great question. And I don't know that I've addressed this much. I did have a video last year where I talked a little bit about harvesting, when I was harvesting my salad crops in general. And so the answer to your question is, it depends. It depends on why I'm harvesting. And so if I'm harvesting for preserving, or if I'm harvesting a large amount that I'm planning to use later that day, I'll typically harvest in the morning. Because for many of the plants that we grow, they tend to have better taste in the morning. And there's been some studies on this. It's really hard to identify exactly what taste is and what good taste is by comparison of a particular harvest. But in general, when a plant is exposed to the heat of the sun, it's stressed. And as we talked about before, transpiration ceases. And so the moisture content of the leaves is going to be less during the heat of the day or late afternoon. So if you're harvesting like a salad crop, a lettuce, a spinach, a radish, something that you want a nice juicy harvest, then harvesting it in the morning tends to give better flavor and better texture because the whole plant is vibrant from the moisture and the coolness of the morning. And you'll see a lot of recommendations from people saying harvest in the morning. But it depends. If I'm out watering and I see that my strawberries are ready to harvest, and it might be late morning, I'll harvest the strawberries right then, before the birds can get to them, before the insects can get to them, or before maybe the sun begins to affect them a little bit. So I'll harvest some of my fruits later than early morning because that's when I'm out in the garden looking at those plants. A lot of what I harvest for the purpose of eating a salad for dinner. And so rather than harvesting the lettuce in the morning when it might be at its peak, I'll wait until it starts to cool off a little bit and it's time to make dinner, and I'll go out and harvest fresh from the garden those plants to make a salad, bring them in, wash them off, and then eat them right away. So I don't have a set time of day where I do harvest. It depends on the plant, depends on the purpose, and it depends on my mindset for that particular day. The chamomile, as I mentioned in this video that's coming up, the chamomile, I waited until the sun was up and the flowers had opened, and that's when I harvested the chamomile to make the chamomile tea. And so be flexible, again, in the idea of harvesting, because there isn't a single answer that holds true for all the plants all the time. You do need to mix up your schedule and your habit patterns so that you can do what's best for the plant and what's best for you. I'm thinking about some of the other plants, like the peas and the beans, for instance. The grandkids were over this last week and they were out in the garden for a little bit, and it was late afternoon. Not an ideal time to be harvesting peas, but they love picking the peas off and eating them fresh, and so that was the right time to harvest the peas so that they can eat them fresh off the plant. So it depends on who's doing the harvesting and what you like with your harvest, and you need to set your own schedule and what you like best. But for the most part, the early morning is when I like to do most of my harvesting and when most of it ends up being done. So there you go. Let's see what else we have. Kevin says, great info, fresh from garden to table, trumps morning. Makes sense. So thanks for that. Yeah, it depends. Root vegetables, where they haven't sent their juiciness back into the plant for the day, I'll harvest the root vegetables like the turnips and the beets in the morning when I'm planning to use them later for dinner. But if I'm going to use the beet leaves in a salad, then yeah, I'll harvest the beet leaves later in the day so they're nice and fresh for that evening. So great ideas. Greg is saying, my cat eats my snap peas fresh off the plant. That's great. The animals also like to get involved with the process. That's so good. And Olivia says, my dog eats the strawberries right off the plant. You know, and it's funny, I mentioned this in one of my blogs years ago, and I think I mentioned it in a video years ago as well. But my garden buddy Shaka, Chocolate Lab, used to bring in tomatoes, green tomatoes. So she would pull off a green tomato and bring it in the house. Not eat it, just bring in a green tomato. And it took me a while to figure it out. But I had a green tennis ball that we would play catch with. And so I think when she would go out and get a little bit bored, she'd pluck off a green tomato and bring it to me, hoping that I would play fetch with her with the green tomato. Because, you know, put yourself in a dog's brain. Green tomato, green tennis ball, yeah, looks pretty similar. So I think it's great to have our pets involved with our gardening, even when they do pluck off some of our fruit from time to time. Okay, Russell says, I'm at work by 6 a.m. Monday through Thursday. I have a 30-minute drive to get there, and my garden is 10 miles from my home in the opposite direction. Most of my harvesting takes place in the evening. There you go. Exactly. Modifying your schedule based on your daily needs and activities and availability. And so nothing wrong with that at all. If that's the best time to do your harvesting in the evening is a great opportunity. I think that's awesome. Okay, let's see what else we have. Linda saying, one of my onions started to form a flower head, so I Googled it and learned it was going to split. Why would it flower and my others did not? Again, probably the heat. Onions are another biennial that should not flower in the first season. They should be ready for you to harvest when you're ready. If you leave them in the ground, they'll overwinter, and then the next season they'll flower. But based on the plant, if it wasn't fully formed when the heat hit or when the direct sunlight hit, now that plant is in stress mode and it will start flowering and splitting before it forms into the bulb or a nice big healthy plant, which is what you want. And so it's not unusual for individual plants. So I was talking about my daikon radish. In that bed of daikon radish, it's about 50-50. And so I've got some really nice 8-inch long radishes that I've been harvesting and slicing up and eating. It's great. And right next to that plant is a plant that has no root formation at all and has started to bolt. And so it's as simple as when they germinate. And it's craziness when you think about the impact that the sun has and the weather has on our plants. But if you have an onion that was germinated 2 days before another, or you put the plants in the ground and one got a 2-day head start and therefore was able to have more root formation and a stronger plant, when all that heat hit, that might be all that's necessary. So some of those stragglers that weren't as strong, when the heat set in, those are the ones that are probably going to suffer and that you're going to see some of these the bolting of. And that's why, you have to look not only at all of our gardens being unique, but all of our beds are unique and all the plants within those beds are unique. So don't be surprised you've got different results from plants that are all in the same bed, because just a few days, just a few hours can make a difference in the life of that plant when it is exposed to those harsh conditions like extreme heat or direct sunlight when the plant is young. It's crazy, I know, but and the opposite holds true too, where you've got plants, and I've seen this in my own garden on numerous occasions, where you have a structure, a house, a fence, a shed, and so part of a bed gets shade earlier in the day than another part of the plant. You'll see a difference in your plants. And so you'll wonder why you have a bed and 8 of the plants are big and bushy and 2 of the plants look stunted. Well, look at the shade. It might be that those 2 plants started getting shade in the afternoon because of the shadows thrown by a shed or a house or a fence. It's crazy that just a little bit of difference in the amount of light and in the amount of heat that these plants get, even though they're side by side, it makes a difference in how the plant performs and ultimately how it fruits. And so think about this as well in your summer planning and in your summer garden. You have to think about those kind of things. I've talked about sun mapping. I have a video on it. I think I talked a little bit about it last week. But this is the time of year to look at your summer garden for those of us in the Northern Hemisphere and note those shadows. For those of us in the Southern Hemisphere, same thing. Right now you're having your shortest days. Take a look at the shadows in your garden on the longest day and on the shortest day, and make note of that and put your plants that want sun in between those 2 measurement points. Wherever the shade is at its longest and wherever the shade is at its shortest can help define where you can put some of your garden beds to ensure that they get the most sun over the course of the growing season. And just a little bit of difference in sun and shade can make a big difference in the amount of harvest that plant is going to give you. And like we've been talking a lot about today, it might actually lead to bolting if the plant isn't ready and you have those hot conditions too soon. Pauline is saying, I only water when it feels dry, but it was over 100 for a couple weeks, and I was watering twice a day because my tomatoes were dry. Yes, thanks for saying that, because like we've talked about a couple times now, modify your schedule. If you've got to water twice, you got to water twice. I was doing the same thing. My tomatoes, all my plants that I just put in the last couple of weeks, I was watering them twice a day a couple weeks ago because our temperatures were in the 90s. They were rough, 33 to 35 degrees Celsius. And young plants, I didn't want them to bolt. I didn't want them to have that stress. And so I covered them with shade cloth and was watering twice a day. Now they're looking beautiful. The temperature is upside down and it's actually cool. And they're doing great because they love growing in the cool conditions. But got to modify your situation if the heat hits. And that may mean watering more than once. So there you have it. Some great ideas. I appreciate all the stuff everyone's talking about. Lots of discussion going on about shade cloth. That's always good to see. Mr. Texas Bone was wondering about the pumpkin trellis, if they need support too. Seen someone use pantyhose. Good question. And I did set up a trellis to grow some pumpkins, but I got a late start, so I'm not sure if they're going to do as well as I was hoping. And so grow vertically. I've talked about this before. You can grow your squashes and your melons straight up on a trellis. And depending on the size of the fruit, it may need additional support. And so, yes, I actually have old pantyhose in my shed for the purpose of supporting the larger melons when they grow up a trellis. And so it is a great idea, a sling of some type. And so when you think about the vines, these pumpkins and melons that are growing across the ground, the vine doesn't have to support anything. It just is growing. And then it flowers and fruits, and you've got the melon or the squash or the pumpkin, whatever it happens to be, that's resting on the ground. When you grow vertically, the vine will do the same thing. It will grow and it'll flower and it'll fruit, and you'll get that melon or that pumpkin on your trellis. But the vine itself might not be strong enough to support that fruit. And so when it gets heavy enough and it surpasses the ability of that vine to support it, then the pumpkin can fall off the vine and you now have a broken pumpkin. So do think about supporting it with bird netting. Bird netting is a great option if you've got extra bird netting. You can use shade cloth to support a melon or a pumpkin, or you can use old pantyhose. And so what you do is you use a pantyhose for instance. You can actually put it around the melon, or you can make a sling with it that the melon or the pumpkin is resting in, and then tie that to the trellis so that the trellis is supporting the fruit and the plant is not supporting the fruit. And that's a great way to grow vertically and ensure that you're going to get the harvest. There's a lot of plants like cucumbers, for instance. I'll tie the cucumber or direct the growth of the cucumber through the trellis so that the trellis is supporting the plant. And I don't worry about supporting the cucumbers because the vine is strong enough to support the weight of cucumbers. But the vine may not be strong enough to support the weight of some of those larger fruits. So come up with a system to support them, and you'll probably have better success. Okay, let's see what else we have. So glad that people are helping out, and Nicole Oliver is getting lots of help as well. I think that's awesome. Linda says, can I cut back part of my zucchini plant without damaging? I misjudged my space. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, you can. Anytime you need to cut back a plant, go ahead and cut back a plant. Now you need to realize, especially with the squashes and the melons, that the leaves, the large leaves, are there to support the amount of the fruit that's growing. And so one reason why a zucchini gets so big is because it's going to be growing a lot of zucchini fruit. If you start trimming off some of those leaves, the plant will not be able to support as much fruit. So don't be surprised if some of those very young zucchinis that start to develop shrivel up, turn brown, and fall off the plant. That's telling you that the plant can't support all the fruit that's on it. Yet again, another reason to harvest at every opportunity. Because if you've got a zucchini plant and there's 3 or 4 larger zucchini fruit on it, and new zucchini fruit is starting to form, but you've pruned off some of the leaves because it was taking up too much space, the plant's energy is going to go into those larger zucchini because those are the ones that are more likely to propagate the plant. And it's going to sacrifice those younger zucchini fruits to support the bigger ones. So when you do prune like a zucchini, try to harvest maybe earlier than normal. So if you like 8-inch zucchini, you'll probably have better success if you harvest when they're only 6 inches, because now the plant will be able to support new fruit with fewer leaves. But by all means, you can prune back pumpkins, zucchini, melons, anything that is getting overgrown. Tomatoes are a great example. We often need to prune back the tomatoes because they just get too unruly. Just realize that whenever you prune off parts of a plant that are providing photosynthesis to that plant, that the plant will respond because it now has less energy. So it will either send out fewer flowers or sacrifice some of the fruit that's on the plant so that the rest of it can ripen. Okay, let's see what Heidi is saying. Sometimes all the squash flowers don't get pollinated, so the squash might not fully form or not form at all. And we've talked about this with the heat as well in the past. That's another one of those things that could cause those young zucchini or anything to fall off. It could be because they weren't pollinated. And so don't be surprised if everything is great and you haven't pruned and you have some of the plants that are falling off or not forming. It could be a pollination issue. And often it's either not enough pollinators or because it was just too hot in the day that it didn't pollinate. We've talked about that before too. Colorado Bird Nerd, welcome to the channel as a new member on the Gardener Scout membership portion of the channel. Thanks so much. Good to have you here. I look forward to seeing you participate in all the perks that we have here on the Gardener Scout channel. So that's awesome. Thank you for joining us today. That's great. Okay, let's see what we have. Lots of talking about Okefenokee swamps and Obi-Wan Kenobi. That's great. It's so nice that you guys can all communicate back and forth. I just love it. Melissa says, I'm moving over to ladies only cucurbits for this very reason. It gets too hot here. Interesting. I haven't really thought much about that, but that is an interesting idea that you can focus on the plants you're growing. I mentioned it, but I mean in this particular context, that as the heat hits these records, and will probably do that for years to come, it is a very important aspect to remember that you should probably consider modifying the plants that you're growing because you can anticipate the hot temperature in the future. Now, hopefully, we're not going to have 112 degrees Fahrenheit in Portland, Oregon anymore. 45 degrees Celsius is just crazy. But you just never know. So add that into your bag of tricks as you look to the future and how you build your garden and as you select your plants, and think about the heat and how that's going to influence your plant selection. So that's awesome. I think that's great. Sarah says, I've started harvesting pollen from male flowers with a cotton swab and storing it in Tupperware, so I always have some when the female flowers open. That's good. Male pollen does tend to last longer than the female pollen. Use it as soon as possible because pollen does go bad. It is alive. Storing it in the refrigerator can help, but definitely use the older pollen first whenever you want to do that. When the male or when the female flowers open, get right to it, and I wish you luck. I hope that works. It's one of those things that I think that's fun that you're trying that. Good for you. Okay, let's see. Pauline saying, squirrels ate all my cucumbers. I used chicken wire to try and keep them out, but they found a way in anyway. Sad, but impressed by how smart they are. You know, and I added, you know, I've got my long list of videos that I will be making at some point. And I actually added to my list this week that thought because the robins, I love robins. Robins are one of my favorite birds, and the robins have been eating all my strawberries before I can get to my strawberries. So I'm planning a video at some point with this thought in mind as to at what point do we, or how happy are we with the wildlife in our garden, and how willing are we to sacrifice our plants and our harvest to those animals. And so I'm developing the ideas for that. It's going to be months before I do that video. That probably will be a winter video, but I know it can be so frustrating when you try to protect your plants from something like squirrels, and then they find a way in, and you want to wring their neck, you want to wring your own neck, but that's one of those things that we have to balance with what we are doing in the garden. And so the strawberries that I have that are fruiting right now are in an area that I want them visible. It's in my archway. And so I want those plants visible. But now I'm balancing, okay, do I put up a little hoop with bird netting over those strawberries? So now I take away from the visual aspect of that bed so that I can harvest. Or do I let the birds eat the strawberries and maintain the visual aspect of those plants? And that's a question I fully haven't answered for myself yet, but all of us do need to confront as we have these pests in our garden. To what degree do you go to protect your plants, and how far do you go accepting that the animals are there and they're going to harm your plants? So look for that video months from now as I grapple with this issue on my own of what I need to do to protect my plants, but also maintain that nice balanced ecosystem that I'm trying to develop in my garden. So it's a quandary that we have to confront. How far do we go to one side and the other? If we're trying to maximize our summer harvest, yes, absolutely. You put the bird netting over, or you cover with the shade cloth. You do whatever you need to do so you can get that harvest. If you're just gardening for the enjoyment of it and to build that ecosystem, it may not be as important, but probably something to think about as you move forward and as you plan future gardens. What aspect is the animal in your environment going to play in your garden? So many of us are confronting that at this time. So anyway, let's go ahead and get to this last little point that I wanted to raise, because it's part of this whole discussion that we've been having today and every week as we look at our gardens, as we look at our weather, as we look about our planting. Every single garden is unique. And I've already said this earlier today, as we look at the events that are happening all over the world, weather related in particular, but then you throw in the pests and the animals. All of us have different issues in our gardens. Every single one of us have a unique garden, which means all of us are unique gardeners. And so that's why it's so great in this global gardening community that we can share our stories back and forth, and we can tell what we're doing this week and what someone else is doing this week, because they're often different depending on where we are gardening. And so don't lose sight of that. In fact, I suggest embrace it. Too often, I think that gardeners have the mindset that they have to garden like somebody else. And it's great. I do appreciate all of you who follow my videos and have great success with your gardening. But I recognize that your garden is different than my garden. And I don't ask anybody to garden like Gardener Scott. I don't ask you to garden the way I do it, because the way I do it works best for me. And like we pointed out when we were looking at Shannon's background behind me, All of us can find new and unique things in our garden, new and unique ways to do things. You don't have to follow anyone's guidelines. And by all means, don't follow my garden plan. Just because I've got raised beds doesn't mean you have to have raised beds. Just because I've got a cattle panel trellis doesn't mean you have to have a cattle panel trellis. Just because I'm growing strawberries or pumpkins or whatever doesn't mean you need to do it. But you can use that as a prompt, as something to get you started in a particular direction. And I know some of you have been growing black Krim tomatoes because I've mentioned that's my favorite tomato. And you love black Krim tomatoes. That's the kind of stuff I'm talking about. If you pick up an idea or a method or the choice of a plant that someone else is doing, by all means, use that as a reason to try something new. But that doesn't mean you're copying that other person. And so, yes, use some of the ideas I have, use some of the examples I offer, follow my videos, but you don't have to copy the way I do it. I think it's great when someone tells me that they tried something that I or someone else suggested and it didn't work. How many lessons are there for you when you try something and it doesn't work? And I do that all the time. I am trying to figure out what works best in my garden as a unique gardener in a unique environment. I don't know the answers to that. I have to explore. I have to try new things for me to be able to figure out what works. And so that's why I say don't copy what someone else is doing because you may not like the results. It may not work best for your garden. So develop your own unique way of doing things. Develop your own unique garden plan, and you should have more success in your garden because as you try something and it works, you keep it in your bag of tricks. And as you try something that doesn't work, well, you annotate it in your garden journal and then you don't do it again. Or if you do it again, you do it differently to see if maybe it'll work a second time. And that's where the craziness of gardeners come in, as we keep trying the same thing, though we might modify it a little bit. And eventually we either have that success or we make that decision to give up. And so think about that in your own day-to-day gardening. When we have questions about, do I give up? Well, the choice is yours. I suggest pushing through those situations where you are confronted by adversity. But the solution may be that you give up. You pull that plant because it doesn't work. Just because it works in a garden in Australia or a garden in San Diego or a garden in Michigan does not mean it's going to work in my garden in Colorado or your garden in Georgia or your garden in Connecticut. We are all unique in the way we garden and what we're doing. And so don't be surprised when your results are different than my results. And don't be surprised when your results are better than my results, because that's all part of gardening. You're going to be able to grow things that I can, and I may be able to grow things that you can't. And we need to just soak that up as part of our gardening experience and love every minute of it, even when things don't go right, because we're developing ourselves into that uniqueness that makes us special, not only as gardeners, but as human beings. And so I say embrace the uniqueness, consider it one of those badges of honor, and it gets you something to talk about. When you get together with other gardeners like this community, you're doing things differently than all the rest of us, and you can brag about it. You can be proud of it. You can share your stories, because that's what makes you special, is your uniqueness. And I relish the uniqueness of all of you and encourage it so that you can spread that uniqueness to the rest of our global community. And also, it's a great thing that you can share with your friends and family and neighbors. And I think gardeners are just special people. And it's that uniqueness of gardeners that really helps make us so special, because we're not copying others. We're not trying to be somebody that we're not. We're just trying to get our own garden to grow and be able to harvest something or sit back and enjoy it and tell the stories. So there you have it. Embrace your uniqueness. Take that forward into your next week. I hope you do have a great week. I'm anticipating a lot of work in my garden ahead, and I look forward to seeing you here next Monday. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.